The Cleveland Torso Murderer, the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Road, a mystery. The Cleveland Torso Murderer killed and dismembered 13 to 20 people between 1934 and 1938. The exact number remains as much a mystery as the identity of the deranged killer. The murders took place in Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and Youngstown, Ohio. The victims were typically drifters, though Edward Andrassy, Florence Pillio, and Rose Wallace were three victims who were identified. Of these, the victims were all still lower class, who usually lived in shanty towns in an area known as the Cleveland Flats. The torso murderer was called so because he beheaded and dismembered his victims, usually cutting the torso in half. Oftentimes, the decapitation was the cause of death, meaning the victims were alive at the time. Many of the male victims were castrated, and some victims appear to have been treated with some kind of chemical. Oftentimes, the victims were not found for a year. This made identification all the more difficult, since they were already missing their heads. At the time of the murders, Elliot Ness was a public safety director of Cleveland. He didn't have much to do with the actual investigation, but it would seem the killer took some interest in taunting him. At one point, he set two victims in full view of Ness's office in City Hall. The discoveries. In 1934, a man stumbled upon the lower half of a woman's torso. Her thighs were still there, but she was amputated at the knees. She washed up on the shores of Lake Erie. Her head was never found. In 1935, two teenage boys discovered the decapitated and castrated corpse of a man with his socks still on. He had been drained of blood and had rope burns on his wrist. In 1936, a woman discovered less than half of a female body wrapped in newspaper and contained in 2 bushels. The containers were found beside the Hart Manufacturing Building on Central Ave. The rest of her was found about 10 days later on Orange Avenue. Well, the rest of her, except for her head. Also in 1936, 2 boys found the head of a white man wrapped in trousers by the East 55 Street Bridge. Police found his body the next day dumped by a police building. The body was clean and drained of blood. The man had many tattoos and ultimately became one of the most notorious victims, but despite his specific markings, he was never identified. That same year, a young girl found a headless white man in the woods. He had been dead a couple months. His head and his bloody clothing was found nearby. Due to the immense amount of blood, it was believed that he was killed exactly where he was found. Just a few months after that, a vagrant literally tripped over the upper half of a man's torso when trying to hop a train. Police found the rest of the man in a nearby abandoned pool. 1937 brought more victims and a more brutal version of the killer. The abdomen of a man was found in the Cuyahoga River. The abdomen had been gutted and the heart had been ripped out. In 1938, police were looking for pieces belonging to another body they had found when they located more remains belonging to a different body. Neither of those victims were ever identified. To this day, the killer's identity remains a mystery.